And there is this line that sort of says, if you're an atheist and you say that there's a problem of evil, you need to be able to account for where evil comes from.
Yes, or what evil is.
Yeah, and I think that's fair enough, which is why I'm always careful to talk about what I'd rather call like the problem of suffering.
Yes,
which is
that's
to say,
okay.
Right.
I just wouldn't predict it's not that there would be no suffering whatsoever, but it's the arbitrariness of it,
Yeah,
the intensity.
That's the hard bit.
Yes.
The apparent arbitrariness of it. Yes, absolutely.
And I know that there are people who, and the problem of evil and divine hiddenness are kind of versions of the same problem, which is why does God allow bad things to happen? And I think that in individual cases, there are things you can say, but on the whole, I find it difficult to believe that there isn't at least one person who sincerely just cannot be convinced that God exists. And there's no boiling rage, there's no hatred, there's no resistance. They just can't believe it. And I also believe that there's at least one person who...
And that's really, really fair, especially when you look at the world. It is difficult. And as a Christian, I'm not here to downplay people's experiences or perspectives on the fact that, yeah, the world's a really messed up place. How can you account for that with there being a good God? Like, it is difficult.
Suffered arbitrary, gratuitous suffering that could have easily been avoided had it been in accordance with the will of the sustainer of the universe. I find those two very difficult to disbelieve, and I also find them very difficult to square with the existence of a God who loves us all and wants to come to know us all.
And therefore, we have to find some kind of way in. I share that question with you. I'll be totally open. The level of one's own personal experience then becomes important.
Yeah.
And I think I may have raised this last time, perhaps we didn't have time. It's because this is a real issue and not a trivial issue. The question for me is there any evidence, oblique or indirect evidence of any kind, that I can trust God with it? Now, that's as hard a question, because you all know the undergraduate type of argument, surely a good God, where does Lucretius' problem, it's all of that, David Hume raised it, and all.
Yeah, and surely a good God would not allow evil to exist and allow me to suffer. And I think a lot of the things that Christians get wrong with this question is that they immediately try to jump to a logical conclusion. It's like, well, you see, logically, a good God can exist and allow bad things to happen if it were for the greater good, blah, blah, blah. And they completely dismiss the lived life experiences and emotions of the person. And there needs to be a much deeper and healthier conversation around, yes, we have the logical conversation of can evil and God exist at the same time, but we need a deeper conversation of, can I trust God with the evil in my life, as we're about to see.
All the rest. And we never get anywhere.
Yes.
Ever. And so I'm a mathematician, and when mathematicians have tried for a few hundred years to answer a question, they can't. They very sensibly try to change the question. And so I changed the question to that equally difficult one. Is there any evidence that we can trust God with it? And that's where my personal experience, based on the revelation in Scripture of the life of Jesus and the way he responded, not only to others' suffering, but his own suffering. That's where I see the way in. And that's where I see people who are really suffering being helped. What I mean by that, Alex, is this. There are two aspects and perspectives on this. The perspective we have at the moment sitting here is observing suffering. It's one thing to observe it, it's another thing to experience it.
Yes.
Now, most people are a mixture. They see gratuitous suffering here, they're suffering maybe a toothache themselves. But those two perspectives are different to a certain extent. And one needs intellectual answers, the other needs pastoral answers. And it seems to me that we need to have a pastoral understanding, which is, from my perspective, a deep sympathy, recognizing the depth of the objection you've raised, that it is real. It's not pretend. People aren't pretending. And the way you formulate it interests me, because you're the only one that's put it that way. And that is, I can't imagine that there isn't a person like this. Well, I just go with you. I can't either. So how does one approach people like that? But there's no generic person. they're individuals, and I find that all the time.
Right.
People constantly ask me, what would you say to a person who?
Yeah.
I said, unless I know that person, I wouldn't know what to say to them.
Yeah.
Exactly. And I feel like when talking about this issue, a lot of times it's one of the hardest questions for Christians. And so when people ask it of us, a lot of times we just want to have this knee-jerk reaction and start to just throw the answers at people. And that's very selfish. It's very selfish on our part because we're not taking the time to get to know the actual individual, what they've gone through, what they're looking for, why can't they believe in God, how is it affecting their lives, and why they're seeking God or why they're seeking something else. And a lot of times we just very knee-jerk, haphazardly throw answers at the person to make ourselves feel good. It's like, yes, I'm a very intelligent Christian. I know all the answers. I understand this perfectly. And the person leaves the conversation not being heard, not being seen, and not feeling the warmth of God's grace. And so that's a big issue that we need to face.
I think people are too quick to provide what I would call a generic answer to a question.
Oh, wow,
and it's
that's what I
meaningless
just said.
because we're all individuals and our psychology, our emotional experience goes very deep.
Yeah.
And the key thing, it seems to me, that has guided me all my life, I must take you seriously. What you say, how you act, how you feel, how you think. And I must open myself up to the questions that are moving you at their deepest. To some of them, I will have no immediate answer. It would be foolish to claim. But I'll go away and think about those things in the hope that even within that context with a suffering person, I can show sufficient empathy to perhaps open a new window of opportunity to them.
Yeah.
Like in New Zealand, when I got there just after the earthquake, and I had to give a whole lot of talks on this topic, and it wasn't easy because natural disasters are harder than moral disasters. You know, we understand war and bombs, and but earthquakes are different.
Acts of God.
Yes, that's right. And I spoke on this business about this other type of question: is there enough evidence to trust God? And as I finished one talk in the biggest congregation this church had had for years, in Christchurch, where the earthquake happened, a note was pushed into my hand as I left the platform. And I was told a lady had passed it in, and it just said this: I lost my husband in the earthquake. You have shown the first ray of light that I have had on this. And she signed it. I was deeply moved by that. She didn't get a solution in that sense.
Yeah.
But she felt she'd seen a way in. And to my mind, Alex, it really is one of the evidences of the truth of Christianity, the array of people throughout history that have in the deepest of suffering and all kinds of circumstances. How it is possible that even persecution refined the church and people were stronger. I'm amazed at that. And I've met some people who've shown immense courage, particularly in Siberia. People were in the gulag and all this kind of thing. And they told me how God had helped them to face it. Now, you have to listen to people seriously. I remember one chap who really, in a sense, humiliated me, if I'm open about it. He was a very short chap for this height. And he told me he'd been put in the gulag for 7 years because of his faith. He was teaching young people. And he just looked up at me and he said, "You couldn't face that, could you?" Well, I was,
Ouch.
I was so embarrassed. I said, no, I couldn't. And then he smiled. I'd never forget his smile. He said, nor could I. But he said, I discovered something. I said, what was that? Well, he said, when I went into the gulag, I would faint at the sight of my own blood if I cut myself shaving. And I saw things there that no man should ever have to see in terms of gratuitous cruelty. But you know what he said? I discovered that God comes in and he acts in the situation, not before it. And that has stuck with me for all of my life because it resonates with what Jesus said to his disciples when he told them they'd be brought before courts, they'd be tried, they'd be persecuted. And that they would know in that hour. And I think there's enough evidence in my mind, personally, talking to people to whom it has happened, that this relationship with God is so real that in one sense it comes in to encourage people subjectively in situations that they cannot plan for, that are gratuitous, that are horrible, and supports them. to my mind, that's part of the evidence. And it's what I would expect to happen if Christianity is true. It still doesn't.
Yeah, and it is one of those things where life really is that complex. And just because we cannot, in our minds, account for everything, whether or not you believe in one thing or the other, the reason that I believe in Christianity is because of the totality of the evidence. Does it make sense in terms of evil? Do I have a way in for the suffering of my life and other people's lives? Does the Bible make sense? Does it line up with history? Does it line up with science? Does it line up with reason? Does it make sense that the universe would have a cause and have a beginning? And all of those things. And so it's not just one question that needs to be answered. It's multiple questions.
Completely answer your question.
Yeah, I mean, because the cynic in me wants to say, well, if religion is just a sort of psychological cope,
oh, absolutely,
then that's exactly what you'd expect, isn't it? That it would show up in times of need and offer people, without providing a rational solution, because it's not true and it can't, it provides this evolutionary psychological purpose of preventing people from falling into
Well, of
despair.
course, I agree with that completely. And that's why I think you need both the subjective and the objective rational side. It's the whole person. And I've tried as best I can through my life to devote myself, particularly to that rational side, because it's often that gets knocked down first. And the New Atheists did, some of them, quite a good job in knocking away the irrationality of some arguments that, sadly, Christians used to use, and I hope use a lot less. So
true.
It's tightened up, I think, the whole position. And also, at the broader level of academic philosophy, you've had developments where Christian philosophers have risen in the ranks, so to speak, to seriously influence the whole discipline. I think of people like Alvin Plantinga and so on. And that is another, I believe, a partial product of William Lane Craig, folk like that who have been impelled to take philosophy and science and so on seriously because they've had to face these challenges.
Yeah.
And that's a good thing to my mind.
I think it's worth pointing out.
Sorry, I'll finish. We'll finish with this.
You're not claiming to have a solution here. I suppose we're pointing to a kind of a recognition of the problem in Christianity, which is to say, this alone isn't going to convince you that Christianity is true or something, but it's going to say that if you've got other good reason to believe that it's true,
absolutely,
this might not be enough to overcome those reasons.
Yeah.
And in a way, I sometimes think that's what faith is. Like if I'm asked to define faith, the way that I see it being used most, especially when it's used, so to speak, legitimately, in a religious context, it's often something like not having any evidence for the thing believed, like in the moment, but having a bunch of background evidence that like informs it. So like, people often say, well, you just put this glass of water on a table and you trust that the table won't collapse. You have no evidence. You've never seen this table before, presumably. Maybe you have, it might have been in Magdalen College for a long time, but you trust that it won't collapse. And although you have no evidence of that, you've got evidence that other tables haven't collapsed, that you've got good reason to believe that Magdalen College probably would replace a table that collapsed, that kind of stuff. So you kind of do have evidence. It's just like background evidence that informs a position.
But it's hugely important. I think this is a fundamental thing to grasp.
And I would say fundamentally, when we have background evidence for things, we're looking at the whole, not just the specific thing. And it's really important that when we are going over these things with people, is that we don't get into an emotional state where we just try to have like the exact answer for that specific thing, because you have to go through so many things. You have to listen to the person, you have to talk to them, you have to understand what's going on in their head. Maybe you don't have the exact answer for this thing, but you can always start with love, compassion, kindness, being there with them, rejoice with those who rejoice and weep with those who weep. And so fundamentally, I would say that part of the Christian walk is not just having all the answers. It's important to study, but I would say more importantly, it's actually to be a human being and put other people first. And when they're suffering, you comfort them, you go to them, you weep with them, you let them know that they're not alone. You show the love of Christ in that sense. You become the personal experienced evidence that there is a God that actually cares for them. And you're supposed to show that. All right, so thank you so much for taking the time with me, guys. We're going to do a lot more videos on the problem of evil because I think it's just important and it's something that I'm personally interested in. So if you vibe with this kind of content, let me know how I can make this content better and subscribe to the channel. I'll see you soon. Cheers.